Welcome back, my sensual owls. The heat is rising, and I know you've been craving this. So pour yourself a drink, let it ignite your senses, and get ready to be pulled into a world where every glance smolders, every touch burns, and every denied desire leaves you gasping for more. Before we dive deep into this story of temptation and forbidden lust, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because you won't want to miss what's coming next. The Duke's Burning Desire Part 2. Chapter 8. The Duke's Final Flame. The days after her final rejection stretched endlessly, each one colder than the last for Evangeline. She no longer attended the balls or garden parties, preferring the solitude of her family's estate. Every mirror she passed reflected a version of herself she hardly recognized. The bloom of her youth had withered, and the once vibrant girl who had captured the Duke's attention was but a shadow. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the Duke's crest. Her heart fluttered as she broke the seal, even though she knew better than to hope for affection. Lady Evangeline, it read in his familiar, elegant script. It would seem our paths are destined to cross once more. My estate will host a gathering in honor of my sister's return from abroad. It would be a slight to our past acquaintance were you not to attend. Duke Adrian Wentworth. Evangeline's hands trembled as she held the letter, the past rushing back to her. She hadn't seen the Duke in nearly a year, not since that fateful night in his study. Her pride told her to refuse, but curiosity, and something deeper, more desperate, compelled her to accept. The night of the gathering, Evangeline arrived at Wentworth Hall, the grand estate that once held so much promise for her. The hallways felt familiar yet distant, like an echo of another time. She entered the ballroom, her gown simple and unassuming compared to the elaborate fashions that surrounded her. And there he was, the Duke. Age had barely touched him. His presence still commanded the room, and his eyes were as piercing as ever. When their gazes met across the ballroom, the years seemed to melt away, but the fire she once saw in him had dulled, replaced by something colder, more restrained. Before long, he found her standing by the terrace, alone. His approach was silent, but she felt the air shift around her as he drew near. The memory of his hands on her skin, the breathless moments they had shared, came rushing back. Evangeline, he said softly, his voice still rich and deep. Your Grace, she replied, her voice betraying the nervous flutter in her chest. He studied her for a moment, and for the first time in years he reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. The contact sent a familiar jolt through her body, but this time there was no fire in his touch, only the ghost of a passion long extinguished. You've changed, he said, his tone more thoughtful than accusatory. I had no choice, she replied quietly. Time changes all things. Adrian nodded, his gaze softening. It does, but it need not dull everything. For a fleeting moment, she thought he would kiss her again. She wanted him to. The tension between them was palpable, but something held him back, a restraint she had never seen in him before. He had always been the one who pursued, who pushed the boundaries. Now he hesitated. I loved you once, he admitted, his voice raw. More than you ever knew, but you never gave me a chance to show you what we could have been. The words hung between them, heavy with all the lost years. Evangeline's throat tightened, and she wanted to tell him that she knew now, that she regretted every rejection, every missed opportunity, but the words wouldn't come. And now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Now, he said, stepping back, it's too late. The pain in his voice mirrored her own. She had waited too long, hoping for a love that never came, only to realize the man she had rejected was the one who could have given her everything. As the evening wore on, the Duke mingled with his guests, but Evangeline could not stay. She slipped out unnoticed, the weight of her regrets following her into the night. Her carriage carried her away from Wentworth Hall for the last time, the moonlight casting long shadows over the estate. She knew now that love was not always about youth or idealized romance. It could be fierce and imperfect, burning bright and then fading. But she had let it slip through her fingers. Chapter 9. Evangeline's Seduction. Years had passed since Evangeline's last encounter with Duke Adrian Wentworth. Time had not been kind to her, while the Duke's power and allure only seemed to deepen. At every gathering, Evangeline watched him from afar, her desperation growing with each passing day. His attention had shifted, now fixed on Lady Bella, the young debutante who reminded Evangeline too much of herself all those years ago. But Evangeline wasn't willing to give up easily. She knew how to ignite Adrian's desire, how to make him lose control. And so, each time she found herself alone with him, she would shamelessly press her body closer, her fingers lingering on his arm longer than necessary. Her lips would brush against his ear as she whispered sweet nothings, her breath hot against his skin. One evening at a masquerade, she cornered him in a dark alcove, her hands slipping beneath his waistcoat. "You remember how it was between us, don't you?" she purred, her lips dangerously close to his. His jaw tightened as his body responded to her touch, but he pushed her away gently. "Stop this, Evangeline," he growled, his voice rough with both anger and desire. "You can't pretend you don't want me," she whispered, her fingers trailing down his chest. "I know you still burn for me." He caught her hand, his grip firm. "You are nothing to me anymore," he said, his eyes dark and cold. "Bella is my future." Yet, even as he said the words, Evangeline could see the fire flickering in his gaze. The more he resisted, the more determined she became. Chapter 10. The Proposal. The grand ballroom was filled with excitement as Lady Bella made her debut. The Duke, ever the image of regal composure, had eyes only for her. Rumors spread through the crowd that a proposal was imminent, and Evangeline's heart shattered with every whispered word. The moment came swiftly. Adrian knelt before Lady Bella, offering her everything Evangeline had once dreamed of. A future, a title, a life. Bella's eyes shone with innocence and joy as she accepted, and the Duke smiled, a smile Evangeline hadn't seen in years. As the ballroom erupted in applause, Evangeline slipped out unnoticed, her mind racing. She couldn't let this happen, not without one last attempt to remind him of what they had once shared. Chapter 11. The Final Seduction. That night, under the cover of darkness, Evangeline made her way to the Duke's estate. She knew he would be alone, savoring the night before the news of his engagement spread. She found him in his study, standing by the window, his back to her. "Adrian," she called softly. He turned, surprised to see her, but said nothing as she closed the distance between them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she began to unbutton her gown, letting it fall to the floor in a pool of silk around her feet. She stood before him, naked and vulnerable, her voice trembling. "I've come to give myself to you completely." For a moment, his expression remained unreadable. Then, something dark and primal flashed in his eyes. He crossed the room in long strides, his hands grabbing her roughly, pulling her against him. His lips crashed onto hers, but there was no tenderness in the kiss, no love, only hunger and anger. Evangeline gasped as his hands roamed over her body, his touch bruising. He didn't bother with pleasantries or whispered words of affection. He threw her down onto the cold floor, her skin pressing against the unforgiving marble. Tears stung her eyes as he took her, his movements harsh, devoid of the passion she had once known. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, as pain mixed with pleasure. His kisses were painful, his grip unyielding. There was nothing gentle about what he did to her. It was raw, animalistic, and it left her shattered. When he was finished, he rose without a word, leaving her on the floor, her body trembling. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto the cold surface beneath her. Chapter 12. Disgraced. Evangeline lay on the floor for what felt like an eternity, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. She felt hollow, used. The love she had once thought he felt for her had turned into something ugly, something she couldn't recognize. She pulled her gown back on, her fingers shaking as she tried to fasten the buttons. As she prepared to leave, Adrian reappeared, fully dressed, his expression unreadable. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked coldly. "I'm leaving," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't stay here." He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You can't leave, Evangeline. Not now. No one will have you after this. You're disgraced." Her heart sank as she realized the truth in his words. No man would marry her now. She was ruined. And the only person who had any claim to her was standing right in front of her. "But," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper, "I could make you my mistress. You would be mine whenever I wanted. You'd have everything you ever wanted. Money, luxury, except for a title." His eyes flickered with that same dark desire as before. "You will always be mine." Evangeline's stomach twisted. She had once longed for his love, his touch, but now she felt only shame. He had taken everything from her, and now he wanted to keep her as a plaything, something to satisfy his desires whenever he pleased. But she had no choice. She was trapped, and he knew it. Epilogue: A Love Lost. The wedding of Duke Adrian Wentworth and Lady Bella was the event of the season. The ceremony was beautiful, the bride radiant in her white gown, her innocence and joy shining like a beacon. Adrian smiled at Bella as he kissed her gently, his touch soft and loving, so different from how he had been with Evangeline. Evangeline watched from the shadows, her heart heavy with regret. She had lost everything, her youth, her virtue, and now her pride. She had given herself to him in a last desperate attempt to reignite what they once had, but he had taken her in the most brutal way possible, leaving her broken and discarded. As she watched the Duke kiss his new bride, tears streamed down her cheeks. She remembered how he used to look at her, how his passion for her had once burned so brightly. But now, that fire was reserved for another, and all that was left for her was the cold reality of what she had become. She would never be his wife, only his mistress, a shadow in his life, forever longing for the love he would never give her again. I hope you enjoyed it to the end, my curious owls. If you were in Evangeline's shoes, what would you have done?